All right, so here are some of my thoughts at the moment around um, code blocks and rendering previews with code blocks. So this has come up recently with two scenarios. So the first one was with mermaid and plant UML diagrams, and most recently Json tables. So Json tables are code blocks that are essentially JSON, but we're now able to render them as tables. At the moment, this is what it looks like when it's all rendered. A markdown table looks the same as a JSON table. From a rendered state, I think it makes sense to render it as a table. Like, I don't think we need to go and make it look different or anything like that, even though that the JSON table may have extra functionality such as sorting and other things like that. I think we can keep them looking the same, because on the page it'll be really strange to see one table looking at one way and another table looking at another way, while you're like the consumer or like the person reading the wiki page or the comment somewhere in the application. But I think it does make a difference when we're looking at how you edit, and there should be some way to distinguish between the both of them when we're editing content. So let's jump into it. If we jump to kind of like first principles or the basic scenario, this is a code block, and this one is an example of a JavaScript example, and we're using the pop-up feature that comes with that, and that allows you to change the different language types, and based on that it does different highlighting. We've also added the functionality to delete the block or to copy the block to reuse in another area. That's cool. JSON is essentially JavaScript object notation, and yeah, it just gets highlighted. There is no rendering aspect to JSON alone, because when you gotta render it as, but there is this idea of JSON table. So here is a type called JSON table, and this is how I think we should be handling code types that have like a rendering element to it, whether it's renderable or not, or they have a preview. And in these scenarios, the default view that we would want to show them is in its rendered state. So with JSON table, we will want to render the table. With plant UML and mermaid diagrams, we will want to render the image as the default. And in this case here, I'm working with the code. I'm making edits, I'm making changes, I'm cutting and pasting from Google Sheets or whatever. So I want the code block editing area to be visible. If this was looking side by side with like a markdown table, this is how I envision that would look like. If you press like hide code, then the code block there would hide itself, and this is probably an area for feedback, but I'm thinking putting it in a box to distinguish that this is like some kind of block element in here. Mind you, we're still in editing mode, so I think we can put some of these differentiations in. But yeah, if you have any other ideas around how we might highlight or block off things that are code blocks, I'm open to suggestions there. It brings us to the default scenario of like an empty scenario where you enter syntax in here, and if the diagram is not able to be rendered or if there's nothing to be there, there will be an empty state. But essentially we would always want to be able to render it if possible, and by default the way that things would be shown, if you hide the code block, if you click on that, it turns into this block here. And same thing here with JSON tables. And on hover of those things, so once I hover over this code block, our pop-up would show. And here I have the option to change the type, language type, show the code, delete, or copy or delete. Same thing with Json Table. So really what I'm thinking or looking at is that I'm looking at these more generically, as in these are code blocks that have a renderable element to it, therefore we should treat them in the same kind of pattern and style. So previously with mermaid diagrams, we were debating back and forth about should we show a preview, the rendering part, or should we show the code part? I think we should default to rendering because it's a what you see is what you get block, and we would want to see the image if possible. And if we want to edit or do things like that, we would want to click on show code. Because I use the word edit, like editing the code, potentially then this could be a pencil, which is something that I suggested in the past. The part where I changed it to a button is that I don't know what icon I would use to represent hide code. So it could be like we have the idea of an I and an I slash, but that's more like preview, show, hide, but it doesn't relate too much to code. So that's why I'm using a button here. And then this is just an example of an error state. The error state here is a concept. If there is, it really depends on what's able to be brought back and what we're able to display inside this block. I'm happy to iterate that during implementation. Yeah, so that is the whole nutshell of using pop-ups to handle this, so that we have a cohesive experience between basic blocks to blocks that are renderable, whether it's Json tables or mermaid diagrams. There's a familiar pattern and setup to how the code block works. So it's progressively enhancing the code block to show an element to be rendered. This is just a quick run through of if we get pushed back in the future around using pop-ups because of like it's hard to use for whatever reason. This is just another option to have in there where we're using part of the block is to put the controls within the code block itself. So there's the JavaScript version, Json Table with the rendering, mermaid empty states, mermaid with some content inside, the mermaid with the code hidden, and there's the error state. Yeah. Any concern or feedbacks, please feel free to message me directly, but I'll be updating some of our issues with this kind of reframing in mind. Thank you.